like you didn't hear that. Okay. All right. We, of course, would like to welcome you to the STEM professional development. We have kind of an overview of today and tomorrow for you, if you will. So the first thing we're going to do with is to look at what do we hope to achieve, and then we're going to be looking at a video called Private Universe, and then current STEM research. So we're going to be focusing on kind of generic stuff that's for math and science, particularly science today and particularly math tomorrow. We're also going to look at how to build a community of practice and some things that we learned from it. Accidentally, of course, we weren't really experts, but it happened for whatever reason. And then what does inquiry in STEM look like? And then tomorrow, as I said, we're going to talk more about math and math pedagogy, principal decisions and how they impact STEM. And then we're going to have quite a bit of time at the end and talk about your campus. So you might want to be thinking about what is it about your campus. Do you want to go look at pull up your scores, your district, whatever kind of data that you might want that you don't already know. That will be tomorrow. We'll have some of that today and then more of it tomorrow. So do you have any questions so far? Okay, very good. You know where to park, right?
And we got to meet Tara.
And you got to meet Tara, you betcha. That is good. Okay, so the next part of what we're going to do is kind of a history of the project, and I think this is probably important because I think it gives you a lot of insight as to where we are today, and as I said earlier, how we got there. It is a lot different today than it was even a couple of years ago because we have morphed, which I think if you don't, then you're going to have problems with it. Sandra Browning is the math partner, of course. Denise Kern is our retired principal and principal trainer. And by the way, she is in Denver with an emergency appendectomy. So she is not here with us this week, but she's doing fine. Yeah, she's okay. Yeah.
She was fine Friday.
Yeah.
She left.
And then here comes Dr. Simpson. This is his room. Okay, well, it started out a long time ago. Years ago, 1998, I thought, well, science and math really link together. Shouldn't we do something more formal about identifying those links? And so a math colleague from A&M, Dr. Jim Took, and I got together, and we started looking at the science TEKs, and we wrote an article, we developed this chart, and it essentially said something like this. If you're teaching the science TEKs, it would enhance the student's understanding of the math TEKs. I don't know if you can see, my light looks kind of dim there. So the science TEKs here in the first column and the math there in the second column. And so that was 6, 7, and 8. And then when you flipped over the chart, it was the opposite. When students are learning these math TEKs, it would enhance their understanding of certain science concepts. So that was early on, and it's kind of intuitive. It's not a new idea. It's only specific for science. But an interesting side note is he moved to Oregon after we both got our PhDs. He moved to Oregon, and I said, let's compare the math in science to the math in Oregon standards. He said, we can't do that. I said, why not? He said, they don't have any. Wow. I said, they have no state standards. So, we've had them at least since 98. They may go back further than that, but at least since 98. And so, thus the movement for the Common Core, because you had a lot of states over the years who have not had standards, or they've had poor standards, low standards. And so, I think people don't understand the basis of the Common Core. It's not a political movement. It actually was an academic need, to meet states. They don't have to adopt them, but they could use them, so it's a good resource, if you would, for only, of course, math and ELA with it. Then in 2003, Governor Perry said that math and science needed to be improved. They'd already done a grant with reading, I think in 1990, and then they decided they were going to fund math and science. So there were 6 grants, 6 math grants, 6 science grants. The math grants, I think, were probably similar to science. So we had a grade 6-7 science grant, a grade 8 grant, biology, chemistry, IPC, physics. So we had 6 of those. And then math, the same kind of thing. Well, I received the grant for the grade 6-7. And so what they did is we jokingly, those of us who were project directors, said that we call it a course in a box. So we were essentially supposed to teach all the science that grade 6 and 7 teachers should know and understand and be able to teach in one course. So we call them the modules. They are supposed to be online. We had a change in technology, and so we're trying to put them back online. We have the CD for them, and they are public domain, and so there should be, all of those should still be online. And we called it Middle School Science 1, and it was based, as you can see, on tax and TEAC standards. So I had this idea, looking at it from a perspective, and I said, well, we need to think about it from a scientific way, and one way is systems thinking. So we looked at systems thinking and analyzing, and I said, well, you could have living systems, which would be something like the living environment in a human body, and non-living systems, which would be the traditional physical sciences, physics, chemistry, earth science, and space science. And so this is what the module looked like. So on the website, you can see that we had a number of documents here. I'm going to turn this. Turn this light. How about that? We had a number of documents there that you could download. So we had the PowerPoints, we had all of the handouts that work with them, everything that we have. In fact, everything we still have is online. It's public domain. Not because we had to on this one, but we don't have to on this one, but we do it anyway. We want to share. And so we have things like pictures of what a lesson would look like, a lesson setup with it, and what part of a 5E, if you would. And we use that actually was the basis of what we call Mix It Up today, because after that, again, I went back to saying, math and science really should be connected in a meaningful way. And so we began what we called the Mix It Up project, and we use that module as a basis to design much of what we do, and actually still do today, that I'll explain later. We designed a professional development model that we call correlated, and there's a difference in our mind between correlated and integrated that I will explain later. So the goals of the 2006 grant, and still today, are to improve the content and pedagogy of grades 5 through 8 math and science teachers. We originally started out as grades 6 through 8, but the elementary principals kept saying, please add grade 5 testing grade, which would make sense. So we said, okay. And then to improve student performance in math and science, and to train principals how to identify and support effective science and math instruction, and to establish a community of practice, which we'll be discussing a little bit later on, among the teachers and their principals, and actually the staff too. So it's a big community of practice with parts to it, if you would. So in traditional integration, math uses science sometimes. So they might use it as an application of math. They might, as one of the math teachers said, to make math interesting. Science has traditionally used math. I mean, we start using math in kindergarten, with measurement. So we've used it for a long time as a tool. We use it to teach or to explain a concept. For example, the photosynthesis equation, I use the math to explain that. It makes more sense, to me, and I hope to my students when we're discussing photosynthesis. Well, the research actually does not support the integration until now. We have current research on there, but formerly there were just a few small, poorly designed studies, and what they reported was it only improved math scores, which was kind of interesting, when you'll see a little bit later on. So in 2010, Browning, that's her with darker hair, and me with glasses, we came up with this professional development model that's a kind of in the middle, if you would, of what you would traditionally see as professional development, where teachers would learn just math, or on the other end, just science. And then the next step would be math with some science, or science with some math. But we have what we call our professional development model that's a correlated idea. So what we started with was 2 different kind of courses. We started with a science-led course, so it was, it was the heart of the syllabus, or the scope and sequence, or the course, or whatever you want to call it. And then we also had a math-led course. So the first one that we started out with, or one of them that we started out with, was space science. And so we had the correlated space science and math, and then we had the correlated geometry and math. One of the differences between what we define as correlated versus integrated, correlated is taught by 2 people. It's taught by a math expert and a science expert. You don't have that typically in public schools. So we're not even suggesting that. But they have to be experts. That means they have a master's degree in their content area and the pedagogy. So we can't just have a scientist, for example, come in and teach our courses. We have to have someone who is also an expert in the content course. This is Russell Dozier. He just retired. He was our astronomy teacher. He's really interesting. And of course, Sandy Browning was our math instructor. So here's what it looks like. We already talked about the teams. We have principals that we are teaching how to identify and support effective science and math instruction. There are 3 days in the summer, as you know. The 2 days that are strictly STEM principal training, and then we want 1 day, just like you have done already, to come into the teacher training. And that actually started out as a request from the principals. We had separate, yeah, Michael, you were here. We had separate.
I was the one who requested.
Yeah, we had the principals in, and they said, well, we want to see what our teachers are doing. I'm sure, I didn't ask them, but I'm sure what they wanted to know is it's sit and get, which if you've been to our training, you know it is not sit and get. So you want to comment on that? Why did you ask for that?
Well, she was sharing like she's sharing now, and what I wanted to know what expectations were, but also wanted to know, well, what are you teaching the teachers so that I know what it is that I can require of them. Because they were saying one thing here, but I really didn't get an example of that until we actually went into the classroom and got to see the interaction that they were having. And I was very impressed, by the way, with how they were correlating it and putting it together. And it helped a great deal because it gave me a clear picture of what the program is. But more importantly, as a principal, what I needed to be supporting and doing as a principal with my math and science. Not just the teachers involved, but ideally to integrate it into my math and science program at school. And so I found it very, very helpful. It's a component that I hope you keep.
Oh yes, it's a requirement now, thanks to you.
Yeah.
So, well, that's a good example of how we've changed. And we change in response to what participants say they need.
And by the way, almost immediately they said, you know, that's a good idea. And boom, we started going down and getting to experience, bless you, going down and experiencing it. And the fact that you could change it that fast and quick impressed me a great deal.
But it's ours. We can do anything we want to it. I mean, it's not ours.
But the fact that you respond to that. I mean, someone will say, "Oh, that's that's an interesting idea. Let's think about that," and nothing ever happens.
Right.
And but boom, I mean, they let us go down. I think that session, and I was tickled.
Well, the other interesting thing was I took them downstairs and I set them at the back. So I'm watching these principals.
Changed.
They are on their phones, they're kind of paying attention. This is not working. You're going to be in there with the teachers. Well, we had a problem initially because when we wrote the grant, our grant was the first grant that had principals as a part of it in the state. And currently, there may be one or two others, but they're not doing it. But they said you cannot provide the principals the same training as the teachers, which made sense. So in violation of that, we took them downstairs, and then we saw they were not really paying that much attention learning what they should, so we said, no, you're going to be with the teachers. We have it on tape. But you can't be with your teachers, because the funding agency said no, it would intimidate the teachers. Well, we also found out that's not true. The teachers were not intimidated, no. When we finally got them with their teachers, their own teachers, they were not intimidated. And not only that, but the teachers became the leaders in the learning. And so now, y'all get to go with your teachers. Well, you didn't initially. We put you not with your teachers initially.
No, mine did, though, and she was the one who was walking me through and asking me the questions. And I'm like, okay, I don't know any of them.
And that's good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's what we want for you, for the principals to experience what students experience in the classroom, particularly when they don't know, and most of the time the principals don't have that kind of background to know. So it turned out to be a great idea, and we thank you for it, and we continue to do that. And so the requirement is the 3 days in the summer, and at least one time, y'all have already been, but you're welcome to come any or all days in the summer to be, with your teachers. Because it's great, the July training, yeah. And then we also are requiring one Saturday in the fall and one in the spring, because that continuing collaboration is critical, and that those conversations are so rich that they really need to happen ongoing. Okay.
Do you have the Saturdays planned out ahead of time? Like, will we get a schedule of
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I have the dates right now, and I'm verifying them with Laura, who's our geology instructor.
Is this information in our book?
It's not in your book yet, but we can give it to you.
Okay,
I have it on my
that'd be great to
phone,
have,
yeah.
I can plan it out.
Right, yeah. So the teachers, of course, have to have that 2 weeks in the summer. We've had some people who have had a problem. They say, well, I can't join mixed because I can't go 2 weeks in the summer. And we've said, 1 day in the summer is better than no days. It's gonna assist you and your other fellow teachers and your campus and your principal. So we've said if you just come one, and we think we can hook them, if they just come one, which we usually do. So, we've kind of changed in that way. We haven't said a full 2 weeks. The best practice strategies that we model and that we try to teach are both the general as well as STEM specific. So we teach with a version of a 5E. Not every lesson should be a 5E, and a 5E should have or typically will have some direct instruction in it if it's teaching a skill like using a piece of equipment or teaching a process, and we'll get more into that a little bit later on. Questioning is general for all disciplines, so it's not specific. So we model a lot of the general best practices as well as some of the specific ones. We use cooperative learning and cooperative group investigations, because even though it's quite common, cooperative learning has been around for 30 years. It is not new, but it's amazing how many teachers do not use it, despite what the research says. Our principals are not requiring some kind of cooperative learning with the children. As you know, we model the use of science and math equipment and manipulatives, because we do the hands-on learning, just like we expect the teachers to do that, because that's how we know people learn best. I have a story about it that I love to tell. Probably 5 or 6 years ago, because I administer the grant, I try to be in there all the time, but sometimes I'm in and out, dealing with the administration. But I was in a activity called Party Punch that Dr. Browning did. And I don't know if she used algebra tiles or Cuisenaire rods. I think it was Cuisenaire rods. And I was just blown away. I thought, wow, why didn't I learn math this way? This is so much easier. And I have a lot of math. I have through 2 semesters of calculus in college, and I use a lot of math with statistics and with the research and all that. But I didn't understand it conceptually. And it made so much sense. I have become a huge fan of math manipulatives. And of course, with science, we always should be using equipment. We do not teach any technology. We used to. We used to use technology. And here's why. Because it took away instructional time on the content and the pedagogy. And so what we have found is technology decisions can be poor or good depending on the content and pedagogy knowledge. Technology is not a silver bullet. It can be used poorly. There's a district I work with that has iPads, K-12, one-to-one. They're worksheets.
But they're prettier.
Yeah. More expensive
Well,
machines.
and that doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, we know from some research that I'll be sharing with you is that students actually understand the bigger picture and understand the concept better from reading on paper than they do on a screen.
Saw that.
Which is, I sent that out to
Very
you.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So there's no silver bullets, including technology. I don't care what your salespeople say or your superintendents buy into this, it's not a silver bullet. So that would include use of probes. We've done that. We've used technology, but again, it just seems to take away from the content and the pedagogy. And our feeling is if you understand the content and the pedagogy, you're going to make better decisions about which technology to use. So we don't jump on all of these bandwagons about different things because of that basis. The grant requires over 105 hours. It's a federal grant, flow-through monies from the federal level to the Higher Education Coordinating Board. The grant is 12 months long, and it includes summer and academic year training. And the reason is because the federal requirements are that because of the research. That if you do not have long-term and intense training, you're not going to see a change in teacher practices. And we've seen that with our own research, and most of you already know that. We didn't see significant changes in the classroom with our observations until after 170 hours. 70 hours in the summer, another 30 plus hours in the academic year, and another 70 hours in the second summer. And the feds used to only allow 1-year grants, and we kept saying, we really need another year with these teachers. You know, it's a lot to learn. So many of them start with almost ground zero, even with the general best practices, let alone the STEM specific ones. So that's kind of what we're seeing is it takes that much, and that's why we've asked for a 2-year commitment on all of our recent grants. What is optional is we have safety training, and TEA has a website. I've been looking at that for the elementary science safety training. There's a middle school one, and there's a high school one. It is certainly a good foundation. It does not cover all of what I would do with them in a 1 or 2 day or 3 day that we've had before in safety training. But we do have some discussions of safety, you know, during our training. So we are going to, it takes about an hour and a half to go on that. So what we will do is we will provide a incentive stipend for teachers to go through that safety training and get the certificate. So they will be able to present that to you also. We have a lot of optional field trips. The Bat Cave we go to regularly. There is a friend of mine who works with Martin Marietta and has invited us to go on a limestone quarry field trip. My grandson is working there as an intern this summer, and he says, Grandma, you should probably wait until October or November to go. So we'll be looking at that in October or November as an optional field trip. So that's additional to our monthly Saturday. On many of the trips we invite families, you know that, and there's a good reason for that, but we cannot pay for it. So families can come on certain field trips, like the Bat Cave. The grant requires that we have a high need campus. That means more than 20% are below the poverty level. So we only have to have one, but we have several, which is nice. And there has to be a high need teacher on each team, 1 per team. So that means they have either a poor certification such as alternative, emergency, or temporary, that they are teaching outside of their certification field, or they have less than 24 hours in the content area. Well, that's that's easy to do when you're teaching earth science. It's rare anybody has anything in earth science. And then, of course, the principal science math teacher team is a requirement for our grant. That's not true for all teacher quality grants, it's just true for our grant. So there's a team, so you have a science teacher, you have a math teacher, they never leave each other's side for good reason. Toby was asking, why do the science teachers need to learn the math? Because they're not teaching that. So I haven't answered him yet. He asked Rowan that, and Rowan passed it over there.
He asked me, and I
Yeah.
said, you're asking the wrong person. You want to talk to Dr. West. She's got an answer for you.
Right, and that's why we have it in that's why the model is there. When we first started this, we started looking at what kind of linkages are natural in certain disciplines. So in physics and chemistry, you use a lot of algebra, algebraic thinking. In earth space science, more geometry, but certainly all of the other math. And in biology, we use a lot of algebra. There were math that's common to all of them, as we mentioned earlier, such as measurement ratio, so it would be the same among all of the sciences. This is kind of interesting. It actually happened at, not Divine, what's north of you, a district north of you?
Lytle.
Lytle. It actually happened in Lytle School District at the 7th grade math teacher's classroom, which is, we love going into classrooms. We learn so much from doing that. But anyway, so this is a typical math lesson. They call them base 10 blocks. We call them leader a leader model, if you would. We've never called them base 10 blocks, but it's the same thing, and we give teachers, you know, one of these whenever we do this. So you've got the place value, so you've got the thousands and the hundreds and the tens and the ones. And we walked into this science teacher's room, and she was using them to teach the energy pyramid. And we said, oh yeah, that makes sense. So, you know, that's a really nice link. So she took the math material of the base 10 blocks and used it in a science lesson, and vice versa. So that's one of the ways that we suggest that integration can occur. It's not that hard. It's not rocket science, but that's not going to happen if the teachers are not together, Toby. That's why we want them together all the time, because they're familiar with each other's materials and having these kind of conversations when you're teaching the energy pyramid and the math teacher recalls this probably from their own education. They, oh, well, yeah, you could use the base 10 blocks on that. We also had a decision early on, do we give the math manipulatives to the science teacher and vice versa? And first we said no, and then we said, oh, well, that's not a good idea. They both need to have them because of different reasons, but they ended up that they both should have them. You should not have to go hunt somebody else for materials that you need, because you need it right here. All of a sudden, oh yeah, I need a base 10 block, so I've got at least one there. So it's not, there should not be a set of materials for a set of teachers. It should be one set for one teacher. That's right, yeah. And that's what the teachers say that we'll see later on. So, where'd that come from? All right, so here's our model. We teach for conceptual understanding, not rote memorization. For that deep understanding, and again, you've been in the training, you can see the kind of questions that are asked of teachers explaining their thinking, etc. And to demonstrate how that might be applied in a new context. So that's what we know it demonstrates a conceptual understanding. If you can take what we think is an understanding of an idea or a concept and put it in a new context, that demonstrates that we really have that understanding. So that would be part of the questioning that we should be using in our training and that you should be seeing in your classrooms. The proper language. For example, science teachers, including this one, has often said reduce fractions, and the math teachers going, no, no, no. So we're gradually moving over, at least we might make a mistake first and say
But I think that's the
reduce.
way we were taught. We were taught as in reducing fractions, so.
Instead of simplifying.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as Browning likes to say, the fraction has no less value. So you're not reducing it in any way, but you are simplifying it. So anyway, use of proper language of each discipline. So that would be part of why they need to be with each other all the time, and that will be part of the list I'll be
I
sending.
think that would be top of the list.
Yeah. We use standards-based learning objectives. I was surprised at least more than once by a school district administrator saying, is this a curriculum we have to teach? And I thought, what? No, we don't have a curriculum, you know. But I guess that may have been common or not. So it is not a curriculum. And it's not just from, I don't know if it happened when you were there, Faith, but I know when Suzanne was there, that there were some discussion about what TEKS were taught in this. So we looked at the science TEKS and we looked at the math TEKS. So it is TEKS based. And it's also based on our national standards that we'll get into a little bit later on. We identify the natural links between math and science, and again, that's why those math and science teachers have to be with each other all the time, because I'm not going to see something in math like Browning is going to see, and vice versa. It's those conversations that we have to identify that are natural, and probably the vocabulary, you know, the proper language should be really looked at in these commonalities here, like fractions that we were speaking of earlier. We also identify confusing language. The story of this, you may have heard, is actually the first year that we did the correlated Mix It Up project is Russell was our physics instructor. We actually did physics first, and we had another math instructor, not Browning, in there, and so we were planning the first lesson on motion. And I'm in there, I've got a couple of graduate students in there, and Russell's really sharp, and so he noticed that the math instructor was using the term motion differently. So he said, what do you mean by motion? And the math instructor said, you know, movement. He said, that's not what we mean by motion in science. We mean moving from point A to point B. So the idea that there's a difference in language here, and that is really critical to understand. So for example, distance in science, we talk about displacement. In math, distance refers to a linear point from A to B. So displacement might be from this place to that place as a crow flies, if you would. Whereas in math, it would be the linear link, so you follow the path from this place to that place. See the difference between that? Now, who would have thought that? And anyway, and so that's kind of where this red flag showed up, and those are some of the things that we've discovered. We also know that there are parallel ideas in science and math, such as positive and negative numbers, some of the skills or processes, etc. So there are parallel ideas, and again, that should be part of the conversation with the math and science teacher team. This is how we do it in science, and this is the same way that we do it in math. Also, inquiry when appropriate. There is probably 90% of the teachers that I've seen, even in the last 5 years, use direct instruction. That's not what the research says how students learn best in math and science. That may not be true in any other discipline. I can't speak for any other discipline. It may or may not be true, but we know that's what the research tells us in science and math. There is one that's very common called a 5E. Again, that is very old. It's probably 30 years old. I used it that many years ago. It's not new and innovative, and it is based on the research. So what the research says to us is if there is a concept, typically you should use inquiry. Now, I've been using 5E for 30 years. There are a couple of concepts in science I haven't figured out how to teach with inquiry. So what I try to teach my students in my methods course is these are not laws, these are guidelines. So, you need to arm yourself with what the research says and all the tools that you need to use to teach math or science effectively, and then you choose what works better. If it's a process or a skill, direct instruction tends to work better. And I'll show you the research on that. It's called the meta-analysis a little bit later on when we get into the best practices. So here's what we saw. We saw that teachers integrated instruction when we were out in the classrooms. They taught and provided examples. They reported in their reflections of seeing the value of integrated instructions. They were using the equipment. They saw the value of using the equipment, and that we saw some generic effective strategies such as questioning. So we saw this at a fairly low level. With principals who were in our training, they were supportive of their teachers with supplies and scheduling. They did provide them time to plan, and they were an advocate for deviating from the district scope and sequence, and I'll tell you the story about that later on. So here's what we saw. In year one, we saw gains in building that community of practice. We saw gains in the teacher's content. They were able to plan and integrate integrated instruction, and on a limited basis, some of the best practices such as inquiry, one concept per lesson, etc. In the second year, again, after that 170 hours, we saw significant gains in these areas. We saw much more integrated instruction, we saw much more best practices, and we saw teachers moving into leadership roles. And then in one grant, we had actually 3 years of it, and so we saw a lot more leadership developing among the teachers with that, with conference presentations, etc. So what do students get out of this? Well, they learn more math and science. So this is what we have. We have control teachers, students of control teachers and students of the experimental ones, or the trained teachers. And so you can see with our mixed teachers, they started out at a much lower level, the students did, but ended up above the control teachers in terms of gains in math and then also gains in science. So we know that students learn more with our mixed teachers than they do with our non-mixed teachers.
Well, then what period of time was that, the pre and the post? Was it the 2
The
years
year,
or was it?
no, this was 1 year,
Okay.
because we have to use the same students.
Okay.
And we do a one-to-one, so we're matching. We actually could give the teachers, and we may do that this year, their own scores on the pre-post tests, so they can see it. We've done that sometimes and sometimes we haven't. It just kind of depends. So we saw language area issues. We have identified barriers and certainly benefits. We already talked about this language issue. So we have homonyms or homophones, we have synonyms, etc., and we actually have started our mixed dictionary here, which you see, our correlated math and science dictionary. We haven't figured out how to publish that yet. We haven't released it, but better is for teachers to discover those issues, not for us to hand them a list. That may be secondarily an assistance to them, but it's really important, and we have that conversation in class. So sometimes I'll even stand up and raise my hand and say, well, how does this vocabulary word, how do you use it in math, or what does it mean in math? My understanding is it means this in science, what does it mean in math? And so, you know, Browning and I'll even have conversations in front of the teachers about it, so they don't think we know it all and that we're not afraid to ask questions with it. And the interesting thing that Denise Kern has said is, she said, y'all model that collaborative learning in a professional way, that you can disagree with each other, but you can do it disagreeably. And she said, y'all just do it naturally. And I said, well, I guess so, because that's what we do. And she said that was good for the teachers to see that. And I actually had a teacher run me down in the hallway after one class. She said, that's the first time I've ever seen that model. I said, really? Anyway. So here's what the dictionary might look like, if you would. So we have a list of synonyms with a meaning. So it would have the same meaning but different vocabulary words for it. The distance and displacement, the first one we've already discussed, so that would make some sense to you. And then we have the homonyms, or you have same word but with a different meaning, as we mentioned earlier. So for a teacher to teach an integrated lesson or instruction, there's somehow in my mind teachers differentiate between that. I don't, but it has caused some problem actually with Jennifer Lickard, that we quiz them or we survey them, how much integrated instruction or lessons do you provide? And Jennifer Lickard, who was my graduate student, so I've known her for 7, 8 years now, she said, oh, 1 or 2 a year. I said, no, I've been in your classroom, I've seen more than that. And she said, well, that's, you know, a formal integrated lesson. And I said, no, that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, and that's how this list came up that we've talked a little bit about, what is integrated instruction or a lesson. You know, it's semantics to me. It means the same thing. But what in your classroom, we don't want math teachers trying to teach science or science teachers trying to teach math. We've seen that, and it does not work. That'd be like me trying to teach math. I know math, I can use math, but I don't understand how to teach it. So we do not want teachers to try to do that. We want them to use the proper language, and again, that just comes from conversations, you know, with each other, to identify whatever kind of confusing language, and actually to identify it to the student, that we'll use distance this way with this definition in math, but when you get into science and you're studying motion next week, you're going to have a different definition for distance. How confusing is that to children? How confusing is that to ELLs? So we have to have overt instruction to say, this is different in math from science, even though it's the same word, it has 2 different meanings. And with illustrations like from this place to that place, with having them draw a straight line and measuring it, that is distance in science, and then draw the pathway, roadway, this is distance in math. So they are drawing it, they're not seeing it up on the screen. To be aware of the proper pedagogy for each discipline, and then as we said, you know, science will use math as a tool, etc., and math can use examples, etc. So in correlated to content experts, we team teach it. We teach it for all of these reasons that we mentioned earlier, and then we do use math as a tool. And Sarah's going to show you an example later on. With the typical integrated instruction, it's not team taught. There's no attempt, so non-mixed teachers is what we're looking at here.
Thank you.
Would not attempt to use the proper language of the other discipline, and certainly not identify confusing language. They're still going to use math and science the same way. Whereas in your mixed teachers, this is what you would expect to see. Not team taught, but they are going to use the proper language, identify the confusing language, identify more links because of that collaborative planning that you have to give them time to do so, and aware of the proper pedagogy for each lesson. And then again, using math as a tool and science as a tool. These are all of the things that we've tried out. Some of them worked well, some of them didn't work so well. But we had science-led courses, we had the physics and math, chemistry, math, geology, math, space and math. We've never done biology because teachers tend to know more biology than they do the physical sciences, so we pretty much stayed with the physical science. And then we had several math-led ones. We've had quantitative reasoning in science, algebraic reasoning, and geometry reasoning in science. But here's what happened. So we planned the science-led course. That's what we teach in the morning for 3.5 hours. So we have a focus, let's say, on density. And so we identify the math, and so that is plugged in whenever it's needed into the science. Smooth. If we have algebraic reasoning, for example, then we've got a physics example or a biology example or a earth science example or a space science example. It just was not smooth. So they didn't look the same, they didn't work out the same way, and our teachers are so needy in math. So we don't do any more math-led correlated courses. We do pure science after lunch for an hour and a half or so. That's what Browning has, and it's pure math. And that's why. Here's a sample inquiry lesson on position. So what is an ordered pair activity? Is that math or science? It's math.
Math.
It's math. And then we go to looking at understanding a rectangular coordinate plane, a real number system, and absolute value, which is math. And then we go to this exploration here Because this explanation is an explanation of the ordered pair activity. And then the exploration is the insectum texanum bug exploration that I created and named. That's a science inquiry. So what did you see happening before science in one word? Math. Because the math was used in the exploration, so they needed to understand the math before they used it in science. That is huge. And then we had the explanation. This is students explaining, this is not teacher lecturing. And another elaboration and explanation, again with some more math, and then some evaluation, summative, formative, of course, in that. So what were some of the barriers? Well, attitude's huge. Huge. So who ends up doing well in terms of this integration? Risk takers, I'm not telling you anything new. The early adopters of everything, those are the ones who, you know, are going to jump into it. And then the collaboration, cooperation, attitude, or personality. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a CTE automotive teacher, and we were talking about collaboration at the high school level of linking the math and the science courses with the CATE courses. And so he said to me, we go to church together, he said, well, you know, Sandra, they have to like each other. And I said, no, they don't. They have to be professionals. Of course, he's laughing at me all the time with my naive thinking there. But, you know, that's really important. And I know when you principals call me about my students, you ask me that question. And I tell my students that. Because in my course, I have my students in my course over 100 hours. Not 45 typical ones. Or not 60 hours, which is a typical science one with a lab, but 100 hours. Plus field trips. So I see them team planning, team teaching, and I tell them, I said, this is important. You must learn to work with people. It's like Stephen Covey. You can disagree, but you have to do it agreeably. And you cannot be damaging to your team. So, you know, when we're thinking about making good changes, not every change is a good change. In fact, a lot of changes that we see are not good changes. But good changes, you know, that coachability or collaborative, and I mean coachability, it's like you coaching me. You know, it's mutual, it's not just, you know, one to the other, because we can all learn something from other people. The authentic buy-in, not just because my principal tells me to or the district, you know, tells me to. And oftentimes the department chair, the team leader, or the district supervisor can be a barrier because they don't know best practices. Interestingly enough, certainly the department chair is supposed to, but oftentimes, I'd say probably 90% of the time, they do not know, or they've forgotten. I have some of my students out in the classroom now that are department chairs, and I'll tell you a story about one of them later on that they've just forgotten because they get out and they get, I call it contaminated in school, and they're going to worst practices, not best practices. So this tends to be an issue. We cannot invite the supervisor, either at the the team leader or the instructional coach or whatever you want to call them. They can come into the training, but we cannot pay them. We cannot feed them. So we don't mind if the AP or the APs can come anyway in here. But if any of those other levels, it would be typically more at the secondary level.